Good day to you from South Carolina, where I'm on spring break, but I'm still at work. I don't have a lot to show you right here, but I did choose to start the video outside to show you some differences, like that pine tree right there. We wouldn't see that high kind of pine tree. I don't know quite what it is in the US, or those yucca bushes over there. See those spiky yucca bushes? Yeah, I'm actually walking back behind my hotel here. I'm trying to point out some things that are different because there's a different culture in South Carolina. Yeah, big different culture from Pennsylvania. In fact, yesterday I was on a tour and we passed a Debutante Ball's house. Do you know what a Debutante Ball is? Yeah, this was a tradition in aristocratic England that was brought here to South Carolina. And it's the idea that when a female has gone through a rite of passage and is available for courtship or suitors, they go to a ball and they dress up in fancy gowns, and you have males there who are the suitors. I actually saw that on a television show last night as well. It was the exact same thing. It was a debutante's ball, but it was a media version taking place in England. So I'm jumping from South Carolina to this media show that I saw last night. It's my way of introducing our subject for today, which is all about cultural analysis. We're taking on cultural analysis. It's our next chapter as we begin our second third of the course. We're taking on chapter 6, cultural analysis. And let's start off by mentioning that originally that term culture used to refer to high culture. It used to refer to ballet and symphony and orchestra and painting, the high arts, so to speak. But along with media, we start to get a different kind of culture. We start to get a popular culture, like the Coke symbol. You know, an old Coke advertisement that somebody collects from the 1950s. That's part of our heritage. It's part of our culture, but it's a media product. So we're taking on culture today, but we're not talking about it in the old terms, the high culture terms. We're talking about culture in the sense of how we lead our daily lives. What do Americans do for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? What do Americans do at holidays? What do Americans do when others are grieving? What do Americans do when people have birthdays? What do Americans do when they meet each other? This is how culture interacts. You know, I was at a bar last night and I did something that I shouldn't have done because I forgot that I wasn't in Mexico where I spend a lot of time. I put my finger up to call for the bartender. And you don't do that in American society. It's seen as rude for the most part. But you can do it in Mexico. So we're talking about culture today. I'm giving a lot of examples that are not necessarily having to do with media. Again, that's going to be the work that you do, is to put together the analysis related to media. So let's go into the types of culture now so that we can start to lay the groundwork for where we look when we want to find culture. And the first kind of culture is physical culture. Physical culture is basically made up of two things. It's made up of our natural environment, like this tree right here, which is in hibernation. No leaves on it right now. That's a physical thing in our environment. And yet our environment is also made up of human-made things, like this piece of paper, my notes on it. That's a human-made thing. A human made that. That's part of our environment and part of our culture. Then we also have a second type of culture, and that's our social culture. Our social culture. And these are social norms that govern our use of artifacts. They are social norms that govern our use of artifacts. So let's say you have your cell phone on you and you go to class and you sit next to somebody who's missing their cell phone. Are they going to say to you, hey, can I borrow your cell phone today? No, that's not going to happen, because a social norm says you do not lend out your cell phone. And on that subject of cell phones, sorry about all these sirens and noises that are going on. This is part of culture in this neck of the woods. Yeah, so also with cell phones, it's the whole idea that if you are talking in public, that used to be something that was seen as a no-no, but now today people speak on their phones really loudly in public, in the grocery store, post office, wherever they are. It's a culture norm that has changed. It's changed our social culture in a way. Now we turn to our third type of culture, and that is attitudinal culture. Attitudinal culture, these are customs, laws, and traditions that you have in your culture. So I went to a flag talk, as it was called, yesterday at Fort Sumter, where the very first shot of the Civil War was fired by the Confederate soldiers against the Union Army on this tiny little island in South Carolina. And during the flag talk, I was reminded of all the things we know about our flag that have to do with our customs, like never letting it touch the ground, or never, quote, desecrating the flag. And actually at the flag talk, they talked about how the flag at Fort Sumter was not flown for 4 years, exactly 4 years during the Civil War. So we have customs, we have laws, and we have traditions that guide our culture as well. Do you know, for example, just to choose a really shocking example, if you get an abortion in Ecuador, the woman is going to be put in jail. That's the law. Yeah, if you get an abortion. So we have radically different laws, customs, and traditions all over the world which affect our culture. Now let's move next to qualities of culture. Qualities of culture. The first quality I'm going to discuss is often very difficult for Americans to understand because they've only grown up in one of the two types of cultures, but I'm referring to individualist versus collectivist cultures. Individualist versus collectivist cultures. In an individualist culture, such as the United States, much of culture is focused on the individual. The person is having the rights. The person is having the interests. The person is having the ability to determine for themselves where they're going to head in life. We talk about rugged individualism. We talk about entrepreneurship. We talk about respecting individual liberties. We do a lot of that in the United States. And you can even hear in the way that people talk, it translates into a conversation where people will have a conversation that goes like this. Yeah, I've got so much to do today. I've got to pick up my kids from work. I've got to go to the store and get some groceries. And then somebody else will say, yeah, I have the same thing. I have to go to the airport to pick up my aunt. And then I have to go get a present for a wedding. And what's happening is those two people are not really, I would say, having a collaborative conversation. They're really just talking about themselves, starting with the I word. And that is part of our culture. We accept that. Versus a collectivist culture. A collectivist culture is very different. A collectivist culture is about a we. It's about making decisions that are best for all of us first, and then if it benefits us individually later, that's okay. That's where you get discussions like taxes, for example. Taxes, nobody wants to pay taxes. I can assure you I don't want to pay the taxes that I pay on my house, but I do that because I know that those taxes go to school districts, and people like myself who went through public schools are going to benefit from teachers and books that are being paid for by those tax dollars that I spent. So that's for the good of the whole. That's the way a collectivist culture works. Next up, when we talk about qualities of culture, is, here's a familiar word, is a rhetorical quality. A rhetorical quality. And that's where culture functions symbolically. Symbolically. I mean, I talked about the flag before earlier as having tremendous symbolic significance. I was looking at my Facebook yesterday, and one of my friends, so to speak, was posting a Philadelphia Flyers jersey that he was selling from a famous Flyer who played on the Flyers. I can't remember who it was. Don't know hockey all that well. The meaning of that jersey for a hockey fan, especially a fan of that particular player, a fan of the Flyers, a fan of the sport, the meaning, the symbolic meaning, the symbolic cultural meaning of that jersey is way beyond what I can ever comprehend, because jerseys don't mean that much to me, but mementos, signed autographs, etc., they have tremendous symbolic meaning for some people. Next up is the third quality of historical. Historical. And that's where you consider a context from one time period to another. So when you look at a particular instance of media in this particular moment, to understand its context, we have to look at past situations where the same media content aired. So I went to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida earlier this year, and we were learning about the space program. And today, we don't have those rockets that we're sending up to the moon. So any talk of doing anything in space, like Space Lab, we have a lab up there with Russians and Americans on it right now, any kind of talk is also in the context of some people who are missing those 1960s days where we went to the moon and put a person on the moon. So context has a lot to do with the quality of culture as well. Context has that's historical context. Now let's move on to the last quality, and that's an ideological quality. An ideological quality, and this is a higher level of thinking, right? This is now tapping into some of our earlier work in this class, but because we're talking about using culture as a way of seeing the world. And if you just look at the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, for example, regardless of what your sympathies are for whoever in this terrible human tragedy, is it not amazing that there are two completely different worldviews that are governing the actions of the actors? I mean, surely Russia does not hold the same kinds of things that we are saying about the war, that their convoy is slowed down, that they aren't getting fuel for their convoy, that it's going slower than they want. I can't imagine that's their narrative in their media, right? So it's really just pointing out, or what I'm trying to point out here, is that there is an ideological component of culture. Yes, culture is going to invite us, if you want to look at it rhetorically, to have a certain worldview based on the culture that you're in. Now let's go to functions of ideology. Let's take that concept and expand it a little bit. We know that ideology does certain things for our thinking, really. That's what we're trying to talk about. We're trying to analyze ultimately what media content says to us about the world, the worldview, and the ideology that's represented in media content. So let's talk about how the functions of ideology help us or hurt us. So one way that ideology functions is it both limits and enhances some ideas while devaluing and negating other ideas. And so if you subscribe to a particular ideology, let's say for example, that you subscribe to the ideology that taxes are bad. I mentioned taxes earlier. I mean, most people would say they're bad, but that taxes shouldn't be raised in any circumstance. You shouldn't have to pay any more sales tax. You shouldn't have to pay any more income tax. No taxes whatsoever. Okay, on the one hand, that may really free you up. You may really say, I've really realized that government has no role, and that the people who are living should be the ones in charge of their own destiny, and government shouldn't be taxing to help people out. That's a way of seeing the world, but then it sort of frees you up to see government in that way, but then it also limits you, right? It's going to limit you from seeing the benefit that you might have from people paying taxes and getting sidewalks, so that people can walk down. You ever try and walk down a sidewalk in East Stroudsburg? It's a bumpy affair, I can assure you. Whether you're on a bicycle or whether you're walking, it's a bumpy affair because the sidewalks are all over the place because individual people have to pay for them. They're not provided for by the government. So it's an example of ideological thinking that both limits and also extends our thinking. Next up is a function of ideology is it normalizes certain aspects of the world. It normalizes certain aspects. Certain relations between people seem normal. It's entirely normal for a student to go to a professor's office and have a conversation about the subject matter, but it's not entirely appropriate for a student to show up at a professor's house or for a professor to be out drinking with a student in certain contexts. And now whether this is a gray area and professors should be able to do that, or whether it's possible in a great world, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how culture normalizes certain dimensions. And the media culture that we see normalizes things like you have to buy toothpaste with sugar in it, because those are the only toothpastes that are advertised on television. Did you know that toothpaste has sugar in it? Yeah. How about that? The last thing you do before you go to bed when you're cleaning your teeth is to put more sugar on them if you're using Crest or most of the other toothpastes. So we do know that one of the functions is to normalize that. Should that be normal? That's something to be asked. Another function of ideology is that some interest groups are privileged over others. Generally speaking, we can say the groups that are not privileged are poor people, minorities, immigrants, and criminals. Now, you could say to yourself, well, criminals don't deserve to be. That's part of their punishment, is having liberties and freedoms and rights taken away from them. I'm not talking about that. I'm not making that kind of judgment. I'm just simply pointing out that ideology does function to privilege some groups over others, and we're going to get more into that later. One of the main scholars in talking about ideology, not necessarily cultural analysis, ideology, was Althusser. Althusser, that's how you pronounce his last name, he had a theory of interpolation. Interpolation is a theory that also uses another unfamiliar term, and that's called hailing. Hailing, H-A-I-L-I-N-G. So interpolation, according to Althusser, says that hailing is when individuals respond to an ideology by allowing it to represent them rather than fighting back. So I do that every time a person says, God bless you, to me when I sneeze. I sneeze and they say, God bless you, to me. And I want to say to them often, and I'm increasingly do it, why are you blessing me when you don't know whether I believe in a God or not? That's not really appropriate, is it? Surely when you sneeze or do something with your body, I'm not telling you, non-God, shine on you, or nature shine on you. Now, many of you may think this is a ridiculous idea, but I don't. I'm pointing it out because it does show that we give ourselves over in certain circumstances. It's like when you're standing around somebody and they use a racist term and you don't say anything, right? That's happened to me. I went to buy a motorcycle. I went to have my motorcycle fixed, and the person who fixed my bike says, you need a part, but don't buy it here. You can buy a cheap chink part on the internet, is what he said to me. I was so shocked and dumbfounded that he would use a racial slur that is not only really degrading, but is so old that hardly anybody uses that. Last time I heard it was in the 1970s to refer to an Asian person, but I didn't say anything, and I was really upset about that. That's Althusser right there saying that I gave in to hailing. Yeah. Now let's move on to ideological processes. This is what we're talking about next, ideological processes. And these are how ideologies become adopted by a culture. Like, how does it get into a culture, the belief that a flag should never touch the ground? Like, where does that start? How does it spread? How does it get embedded? Well, here's what we're talking about here. And by the way, I was remiss in introducing the main thinkers behind cultural studies, and I want to do that now because they had a lot to do with these areas that I'm about to talk about. So let me just sidestep for a moment and talk about Raymond Williams and also Stuart Hall. Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall, these are both scholars from Birmingham, England, and they were interested in how mass media produce culture. Yeah, they were interested in how mass media produce culture. When you watch a Super Bowl, you're not just watching an event on television, you're watching your culture being produced. I was reading yesterday that Snoop Dogg, I don't know if this is true or not, was not supposed to be wearing a blue bandana during the Super Bowl, according to the agreement with the producers, because it would be too gang related to the Crips. And typical Snoop is what they were saying. He wore a whole blue bodysuit to defy that restriction that was placed on him. And so, how do ideologies become adopted by culture? We're looking at the production of culture from Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall. That's what mass media do. And so now to get back to ideological processes, that's what we're talking about here, how ideologies are adopted by culture. We've got the myth. So the myth you already know from Barth. We studied the myth already. That's a sacred story that goes around. Religion has myths. Baseball has myths. ESU has myths. The fraternity next door to me has a myth. It has a myth that there's a ghost that haunts the Sig Pi house. Mythologies, myths, they function to perpetuate worldviews, the way that we should see the world. And then we have another term now I'm going to introduce, probably a new term for you. It's called Doxa. Doxa, D-O-X-A. This is knowledge that is beyond question. It's unquestionable. It's unexaminable. It's just taken for granted that it is automatic. Like dog food. Dog food, right? People go to the store and they buy food, especially for their dog. It's got all these nutrients on it. It says so on the package. But wait a minute. Why do we even have a concept of dog food? I mean, why don't we just give them leftovers from people food? Why is dog food even a thing? I mean, can you imagine what's in there? I know a lot about the meatpacking industry, and they even use the toenails of pigs in some products that are sold as food. And so what's in dog food? Really, do you know? Why is it a thing? Why don't we just feed dogs what people... I mean, obviously dogs have other nutrient needs, like they probably need a lot of roughage. They don't need salads like we do, but why can't we give them meat? Why do we need a product? That's Doxa, or an example of Doxa. It's knowledge beyond question. It's the idea that not just that we need food for a dog that has to be purchased, but it's processed food and packaged food and sold by a brand that we trust, like Purina, et cetera, et cetera. All right, next up is yet another level of ideological processes, and this is called hegemony. This is called hegemony, and this is the process by which one ideology pushes another one underneath. Very interesting, isn't it? So, for example, it's where you convince people through propaganda to believe a certain way. So I've already mentioned one side to the Russian war. Let's mention Russian-Ukrainian war. I should probably say Russian war. But let's go on to another side to try and demonstrate another way of looking at this. I read, I was reading some BBC News stories, British Broadcasting Corporation stories, and they were basically capturing Russian news stories reporting on the war. And the Russian news stories were not calling it a war. They were calling it a special operation. The Russian news stories were not talking about invading all of Ukraine. They were just talking about invading the Donbass region where there are a lot of Russian speakers. The Russian media were not talking about a lot that we're talking about in the war, and it's vice versa for us. We're not talking about that much, at least anyhow, Russia's reasons for going into the war. So this is what we have here. We have hegemony. It's where one ideology, in the case of Russia, our ideology, when I say our, I mean Western ideology about what the cause of the war is, being subverted under their ideology. And in the United States, we have the exact same thing, their ideology being pushed under ours. That's called hegemony. It's like aggressive ideology, right? It's like an ideology that wins a chess match with another ideology. All right, now let's go on to processes from Hall and Williams. Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall are two thinkers. Two processes that we're going to talk about to help understand culture. So one process is called the structuralist process. The structuralist process. Structuralists looked at how ideology and power and privilege and oppression, an ugly word there, coming from Marxism actually, this is what structuralists look at. And so yes, we are starting to tiptoe towards racism and sexism. That's what we're going to end up, because it was the structuralists that started to point out inherent racism, inherent sexism in our structures of society, including our media structures. If you look at, for example, media managers, 2% are African Americans. 2% of media managers are African Americans. That means people operating at managerial decision-making levels with employees underneath them supervising. 2%. Okay, if you look at the population, we have roughly 12 to 14% African Americans. So is there something amiss there? I think so. We're missing a whole 10%. So what's going on there? Is it bad luck? Or is there something structural? That's what structuralists look at. And then there's culturalists. This is another process group, culturalists. And they look at how particular beliefs and activities of individuals in a given culture shape that culture. So the structuralists look at the larger, broader rules of society, norms, etc., whereas culturalists, they look at individuals. So I saw an interview with William Barr last night on television. William Barr was the Attorney General for Donald Trump, and they asked him whether there was systematic racism in the country. They asked the former Attorney General, the highest law enforcement officer in the land, and he said he thought that it was a cop-out. That was his terms. Cop-out. Very interesting. I'm not saying that his interpretation is right or wrong. I'm trying to identify, in essence, an example, a culturalist example, right? We have a media organization that's interviewing an individual person. That individual person is offering his opinion. He even said so. He even said, this is my opinion. And that's where culturists look to try and find ideology in the individual. Now let's move to, as I said, ideology and media representations of class. Ideology, ways of seeing the world, and media representations of class. Class talking about not just rich, poor, middle class, ultra rich, ultra poor, poverty, etc., but also talking about the behaviors, the expected behaviors that go along with that, like a debutante ball, for example. So when we look at ideology and media representations of class, we look at how popular media texts, there's that word again, text, that's any content in the media. We look at how popular media texts communicate, justify, and maintain disproportionate socioeconomic status. Okay, now one of the terms introduced here is actually really relevant to your lexicon and your era. You know how you use that word bougie today? Young people use that word bougie. That actually comes from a French Marxist term, is bourgeois. Yeah, bourgeois, that's referred to those people who are in a semi-middle class. They're owning things, or they're not working with their hands, so to speak. And so with that term, we're going to modify it and call it a petite bourgeois. A petite bourgeois. Those are the people who are in the position of having power by virtue of their wealth, and also by their class standing. Their class standing, and also by, unfortunately, their race and their gender. So if we look at ideology and media representations of the class, one of the most basic ideological perspectives that's communicated to an American from very early days, which is also represented in the media in shows like Shark Tank and other entrepreneurial shows, is the American dream. You know the American dream, right? It's anybody, no matter what their background, can rise up to become an Elon Musk. Well, he's not American, he's South African. Can rise up to become a Jeff Bezos or a Mark Zuckerberg or any other person who has become really, let's Cardi B. Let's choose a female as well. And that's what the American dream is all about. But in actual fact, not everybody has the same fair chances to become a very rich entrepreneur. There are structural things that are stacked against you. Some would argue, if you are black, if you are Asian, if you are Latino, if you are gay, if you are female, if you are atheist, I'm going to throw that one in there. Yeah, it's not exactly a level playing field. However, we celebrate the American dream. Whether we can achieve it or not, even poor people, they believe in it. Well, not even poor people. I mean, lots of poor people have become rich. I was watching a guy yesterday. He was homeless. And somebody overheard his voice, and then suddenly he became a voiceover specialist for television shows. So yeah, for sure, poor people can become rich. But one of the most important components of the ideology of class differences in our particular culture is what Thorstein Veblen, he's a philosopher, Thorstein, unusual name, Thor, Thorstein Veblen, Veblen, he talked about the idea of conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption. I love this concept. I remember studying it back when I was in 5th grade. So conspicuous consumption is where you publicly display what you own and what you have. It's not enough for you to be satisfied with what you are taking in. You have to show others. That's how you achieve your status and your well-being. So for example, again on Facebook yesterday, I saw somebody posting almost 70 degrees. First time with the top down. And there was a picture of 2 people in a convertible. And that's conspicuous consumption, right? And in the hashtag, it said Audi. Okay, so this is conspicuous consumption. It's not enough for that person to have been able to afford the car that they want and then to just enjoy it on their own with whoever they're with. They have to show others because it's part and parcel of, I guess, perhaps, according to Thorstein Veblen, of displaying that economic achievement as part of a self-satisfaction. Which takes us now to our final subject for today, which is media, ideology, and representations of race and ethnicity. And the first concept we're going to talk about when we're talking about race and ethnicity, and representations of those in an ideology in the media is whiteness. Whiteness, we have a lot of whiteness in the media. White privilege, you might want to think of it that way. And it does refer to an over-representation of white people in the media. I've already illustrated that with media managers and African Americans, but over the course of time, media have engaged in several versions of whiteness that support whiteness, including whitewashing, where you actually have white people playing minority characters like David Carradine, a white guy playing Kung Fu, an Asian person. Of course, that show's kind of old, so media have improved their situation somewhat. But let's talk about the other areas. Let's talk about exclusion. Exclusion is where the media content does not cover something, so therefore it is written out of history. Exclusion is written out of history. Down here in South Carolina, I was looking at bricks on the side of a building, and they used to make bricks on the plantations, the slave plantations down here. They had plantations for rice as well, but they made bricks, and the guide showed us not just fingerprints in the bricks, not just fingerprints of the people who put the bricks away, but children's fingerprints, showing us that child labor was being used. Now, have you ever heard about that? I hadn't. And so, yeah, it doesn't exist, right? It's written out of history. It's not in our books. Form of mass media is written out of history. That's exclusion. Then we also have stereotyping. Stereotyping is an often misunderstood term. There is a kernel of truth in stereotyping, but the problem is it's a reductionist view of an individual. It reduces them to that being their only quality. They're a Mets fan, right? Said in with that kind of tone, that's a stereotype. That's reducing somebody to putting up to, I don't know what it says. Maybe I should have chose Yankees fan. I don't know, but it says certain characteristics about them. That's what stereotyping is. And I just, from the first day the TV show Cops was on the air, I couldn't believe it was on the air. I was like, every person who's being arrested here, and I'm talking in the 1990s when I first started watching it, is black. And every arresting officer is white. So, I said to myself, how can that happen? And finally, after a long time, Black Lives Matter, that show got removed. And in its place, Cops came back, but now you see much more attention being paid to black officers and Asian officers and Latino officers being featured arresting white people. Next up is the concept of assimilation. Assimilation, and this is representing minority groups in the media by stripping them of their original cultural beliefs. Now, this is kind of a rub for some, because some would say, if you have a country where people are moving here, everybody should assimilate. We should all become Americans, right? But this argument is taking the opposite view that what can also happen is reducing those people's original cultures, like Taco Bell. I can tell you Taco Bell is not Mexican food. There is very little about Taco Bell, starting with the very basic, the tortilla, that resembles anything authentically Mexican. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about putting Mexico into our culture with Taco Bell. It's certainly got a Mexican feel to it, but it's stripping the Mexican culture from the food. And what a taco, let me tell you, you have a taco in Mexico, you're not going to be eating at Taco Bell anymore. All right, now let's go to our final two concepts. I know we're running a little bit longer than normal here today. The next one is othering, and that's where you marginalize minorities. And you do this by making them seem weird, strange, or others. They are not part of you, they are others. There used to be a policy in the military, no longer exists, called don't ask, don't tell. And that was the first opening to allow openly homosexual people to serve in the media, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. They could serve, but it had to be privately held. That's gone now. That process is still othering. It's saying, you can join, sorta. You can join, but nobody can really know your full story, so you're othered. So othering is that process. It takes place by bullying. It takes place by non-confirmation, not acknowledging others. It takes place through a lot of processes. Which takes us to our final concept for today, which is exoticism. Exoticism, E-X-O-T-I-C-I-S-M. Exoticism, that's where images of foreign lands and people representing them are portrayed as primitive, quaint, and even animalistic. So if you go look at news coverage of Iran, you often will see in American news coverage people jumping up and down in Iran. Now, I can assure you that the way that we interpret that jumping up and down is very different from what is happening when Iranians are jumping up and down. And same with Africans. You know, Africans have, not all, I don't mean to talk about people from a whole entire continent. I've only been to one African country, Ghana. But I can tell you that dance and jumping is a very important expression, a bodily expression for the celebration of harvest, celebration of family events like births and marriages. And so jumping up and down is very important. But through the lens of our media coverage, sometimes we look at that and we say, these people are crazy. They're primitive. What are they doing? This is not the way people, you don't see people walking down Main Street in Stroudsburg jumping up and down. That's what we're talking about with exoticism. When we feed it through our own media system, those peoples around the world, Mexicans, Costa Ricans, Russians, they appear exotic in a strange way, in a different way, in a way that we would not ourselves be comfortable being. And that is sort of the ultimate implication, because our cultural reinforcements ultimately return us to the idea that we are in the best culture we could be in. And so there's a self-culture bias in the media. Have a great day.